Anyone who holds the old stereotypical opinion that the God of the Old Testament is wrathful and judgmental, in contrast to the God of the New Testament, who is loving and merciful, should carefully read the book of Jonah. So familiar are the details of this captivating story that a brief summary will set the scene for us. Jonah the prophet is commissioned by the Lord to go and preach a warning to Nineveh of its impending destruction. In this case, geography is theology, because Nineveh was located 230 miles north of present-day Baghdad. Nineveh is the seat of the most evil empire, marked by greed, grievance, and violence. The Lord calls upon Jonah to preach the word to this most evil empire. However, Jonah buys a ticket for a seat on a passenger boat that flees 2,000 miles in the opposite direction towards Spain. An act of God on the high seas threatens to destroy the boat and all aboard it. Phoenician sailors, ironically more deeply religious than Jonah, determine who is the culprit for this predicament and agonize over what to do about it. Despite the moral ambiguity posed by the circumstances and their reluctance to risk the loss of life, the Phoenician crew tosses Jonah overboard into the deep blue sea. Jonah becomes dinner for a large marine creature. He finds himself entombed in the big fish for 3 days and 3 nights. We've heard that time frame before. From the entrails of the fish, Jonah pontificates a prayer so full of pious platitudes that the poor sea creature vomits him up onto dry land. Our text begins with the Lord's refusal to give up on stubborn Jonah. The prophet of the Lord gets a second chance to go off to the most evil empire and preach the word. In the midst of the great city, Jonah unleashes a 5-word sermon whose brevity is only matched by its lack of sensitivity to the proper distinction between law and gospel. 40 days and you're toast. And yet, in spite of Jonah's terrible preaching, the response far exceeds that of any modern evangelistic crusades. The formerly evil people of the most evil empire believe in God and exhibit a change of heart so effective that a fast is proclaimed, and all are clothed in sackcloth and sprinkled with ashes, from the king all the way down to the cattle. The account in the original language implies that the animals have a more robust belief in God's mercy than Jonah does. God startles Jonah once again by calling off the whole judgment upon Nineveh. And the prophet is not pleased at all. Jonah is still stuck in the syndrome. Our world, nation, and families continue to suffer from the Jonah syndrome. It is evident in a world where individuals cry out in prayer for mercy for themselves, but demand vindictive justice for everybody else. It is evident in a nation where loyal opposition turns into nasty partisanship. It is evident in our overpopulated prisons where rehabilitation is a curse word. The Jonah syndrome creeps into our church life when we place unreasonable demands upon folks without understanding the totality of all of their important commitments and challenges. It is evident in a marriage where one spouse demands and demands from the other without recognizing the need to balance demands with affirmation and kindness. Jonah, dear Jonah, don't you get it? Nineveh is not worthy of God's mercy and loving kindness. Iraq and Iran are not worthy of God's mercy and compassion. North Korea surely is not worthy of God's mercy. Lately, is America worthy of God's mercy? Who is? This is exactly why Jonah had fled from the Lord's call in the first place. He wanted to be the gauge of merited mercy. He wanted to be the broker. He wanted no part in the deliverance of a brutish and banal empire. By the end of this captivating narrative, Jonah continues to wrestle with the fact that God can be merciful upon whomever God chooses to be merciful. That's why God is God. Beloved of God, what is at stake in this gospel-centered story is the triumph of divine mercy. What is at stake here is the triumph of God's mercy for the individual, so that the individual can commend that mercy to others, including one's worst enemies. What is at stake here is the triumph of God's mercy within the community of faith, so that members of that fellowship can be sensitive to the timing of when to demand and when to commend, when to admonish and when to forgive. What is at stake here is the triumph of God's mercy in our nation while being truthful about the hurt and pain that require mercy for ultimate healing and reconciliation. This does not mean that the role of law, judgment, and accountability are not important. What it does mean is that in our moral universe, God's mercy triumphs. God's mercy gets the last word. With Brother Jonah, the Spirit calls every single one of us